the United States has a lot of sway with the government of Israel, and they should use that relationship to get Israel from stop allowing these forced evictions, endorsing these forced evictions. And as I said, I believe that it's wrong. I don't believe that that should be going on. I don't believe that there should be any United States money that's used for that purpose.
As the global outcry over attempts to evict Palestinian residents in occupied East Jerusalem grows, members of the US Congress are calling on the Biden administration to take a tougher stand against Israel's actions. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Ghida Fakhry. As Israeli security forces continued their attacks against Palestinians in occupied East Jerusalem, the Biden administration has come under renewed criticism for failing to take a firm stance against the Israeli government. After Israeli forces stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque in the Old City of Jerusalem, using tear gas and rubber bullets while worshippers prayed during the final days of Ramadan, Israel launched airstrikes in Gaza that left dozens of civilians wounded and many dead, including several children. Leading congressional members of the Democratic Party condemned Israel's use of force and its efforts to forcibly displace Palestinian families in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of occupied East Jerusalem. Senator Bernie Sanders said, quote, "The United States must speak out strongly against the violence by government-allied Israeli extremists in East Jerusalem and the West Bank and make clear that the evictions of Palestinian families must not go forward." Senator Elizabeth Warren also called on the Biden administration to speak out against Israel's efforts to forcibly displace Palestinians, saying, quote, "The forced removal of longtime Palestinian residents in Sheikh Jarrah is abhorrent and unacceptable. The administration," she says, "should make clear to the Israeli government that these evictions are illegal and must stop immediately." Several other Democratic members of Congress called on the Biden administration to stand up for the rights of Palestinian families and urged the Israeli government to stop its evictions, calling the violence against Palestinians completely unacceptable. Now, with the Israeli government receiving $3.8 billion in military aid every year from the US government, a growing number of lawmakers on Capitol Hill are questioning the way that money is being used.
In terms of aid to Israel, in my view, the American people do not want to see that money being used to support policies that violate human rights and that treat the Palestinian people as second-class human beings.
As the debate in Washington over conditioning aid to Israel gains momentum, what impact will it have on the Biden administration's tepid response to Israel's escalating use of force? Mitchell Plitnick joins me now. He is president of Rethinking Foreign Policy and co-author of Except for Palestine. He's also director of the U.S. office of B'Tselem, an Israeli human rights organization. Mitchell Plitnick, you've been carefully documenting every single statement, every tweet made by U.S. politicians over the last few days since Israel began its attacks on peaceful protesters in Sheikh Jarrah. Are you seeing a new trend, a new willingness to speak out? Just how much of a real shift is going on in the U.S. Congress?
Well, I think I've done my best to document as many of these statements as possible, and there's no question that the statements out of Congress are overwhelmingly backing Israel and framing this as almost an unprovoked attack from Hamas, as if nothing had happened the previous week. That being said, there's more Democratic voices coming out of Congress than there have been ever in my memory that are pointing out that Israel did a lot to escalate this. They have been, even before all of this started, they had been speaking out about the evictions in Sheikh Jarrah and talking about the problematic nature of evicting Palestinians from homes they've been in for generations, the unfair application of laws to that case. They were also speaking out against Israeli security forces impeding progress at the Damascus Gate, access for Palestinians to the Al-Aqsa Mosque in the Old City of Jerusalem. During the month of Ramadan, people were noting that that is just not acceptable and not okay. So they were talking about a number of different aspects that contributed to the current escalation. And it's heartening to see. And there's more than just, it's not just the so-called squad of Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, who we've come to expect this from. There's also, there's Mark Pocan, Betty McCollum has been doing this for years. And there have actually been a number. Senator Tim Kaine, I think, put out a very sympathetic tweet, although he, talked about both sides. There's, some complaint that some of these people are sort of playing both sides of the fence. But, the fact is playing both sides is a lot better than just playing just the Israeli side, which is what has been the norm and what most members of Congress are still doing.
As you say, it's a growing number of Democratic lawmakers coming out, and not just the usual suspects. There's an increasing number of so-called mainstream politicians willing to come out and criticize Israel. How much of a small victory is it for human rights defenders, whether Palestinian, American Jews, or others, to hear this growing chorus, however limited it still is, of US lawmakers willing to do the once unthinkable, which is criticize Israel? Has a taboo finally been broken?
It's starting to be. I don't want to overstate the case. There's certainly a change. I think a lot of it, frankly, has to do with Israel's own actions over the past 5 years or so, where the Netanyahu government has made a sort of political decision to embrace the Republican Party and really shun the Democrats. That started while Barack Obama was still in office, so it's not just a relic of the Trump years. I think that's a big part of it, and whether or not the Israelis have learned from that to try and reverse it, remains to be seen. But I think that's a lot of what's happening. But the biggest part has really been the work of Palestinian rights activists and supporters in the United States who have been pushing for many, many years. I'm proud to say I helped start one of the key organizations that does that, Jewish Voice for Peace. That shift in the discourse. It's been slow, it's still slow, and it's only opened a crack, but that crack is getting bigger. And it affects politics, even though, again, much too slowly. We are finally starting to see some effect on Capitol Hill.
Well, you say the crack is getting bigger. It certainly is, very slowly, though. You still saw recently at least 70% of House members, 3/4 of the House of Representatives, Republicans and Democrats, swearing their allegiance virtually to Israel. Some things don't really change, do they? Is it the pro-Israel lobby that still looms large and threatens everyone's political career, or is it an ideological belief for some?
I don't think it's either or. I think there's a number of factors. I think those two are very big ones. I think that a lot of people truly believe, because they really don't, there's still a lot of ignorance about the situation in Israel and Palestine. There's still a lot of context that is just not present in the United States. A lot of people, including members of Congress, honestly don't know any better.
Well, the US media isn't covering the situation either.
And yeah, I mean, we've seen, when the U.S. media has talked about this, it's been about clashes. They talk about Hamas attacks on Israel in the same way they talk about Israeli attacks on Hamas, as if the two sides are equal. The disparity of power is not presented. The disparity in the living conditions is not presented. So, I think that's a big part of it. There's no denying that the pro-Israel lobby plays a major role in shaping the discourse. But there's also the fact that, U.S. policy is based on U.S. interests, and many of the people in both parties who make those decisions see Israel as an important cog in the U.S. sort of world machine, whereas the Palestinians, they don't see as even potentially offering much of anything.
But is it really based on U.S. interests? What do you make of the Biden administration's almost deafening silence? Here's a president who promised that respect for human rights would be central to his foreign policy. Are you as baffled as many people are by the Biden administration's position, limiting itself to the usual statements of, as you say, both sides must de-escalate, these are clashes, expressing deep concerns? Isn't the situation much more clear-cut? I mean, here's what the State Department spokesman said a couple of days ago.
When you talk about supporting Israel's right to defend itself, that includes, I'm assuming, but correct me if I'm wrong, that includes their retaliatory strikes against Hamas targets in Gaza, right?
We're speaking of the principle of self-defense. We
No,
certainly.
I'm asking if you think that the principle of self-defense applies to the retaliatory, the airstrikes that they're conducting in response.
Matt, this
to
is a very fluid situation. I would hesitate to comment on operations beyond, the rocket fire that is clearly targeting innocent civilians in Israel. So I would hesitate to speak to specific operations that have just occurred. But the broader principle of self-defense is something we stand by on behalf of Israel and every other country.
Do you condemn the killing of Palestinian children?
Obviously, and these reports are just emerging, and I understand, I was just speaking to the team, I understand we don't have independent confirmation of facts on the ground yet, so I'm very hesitant to get into reports that are just emerging.
So here's the State Department spokesman refusing to condemn the killing of Palestinian children, refusing to accept Palestinians' right to self-defense. Should we be surprised by all of this?
I don't think so. Biden is, first of all, Biden's sort of progressive leanings have been much more visible in terms of domestic policy than in terms of foreign policy, where he really is still very much old school and sticks with what he has always known. On the question of Israel-Palestine, he seems to have intentionally tried to deprioritize this, stay away from it, and try and move as far from it as is politically feasible for him. And I think that's part of this. I think he was not prepared for a flare-up. I think he and the State Department both are not quite sure how they want to handle this. I'm sure they recognize that they're getting caught between their statements about upholding human rights and their complete indifference to what's happening to the people of Gaza right now.
But shouldn't they have been prepared? When you hear the State Department spokesman say, we believe in the concept of self-defense, we believe it applies to any state, knowing that the U.S. doesn't recognize the state of Palestine, what does it say to you?
It says to me that they are trying very hard to get away from this whole issue. They are now. What that means for the Biden administration is they're going to continue to support Israel militarily, financially. They're trying to tone down some of the political support, but they're not at all prepared to just reverse Democratic talking points of many, many years right now to do that. And I think and in many ways that makes the situation even worse, because basically they're letting Israel off of any kind of leash that might exist and saying, go do what you want. And really, they are unprepared to say anything negative about it. I think that's what we're seeing. I think we're seeing really the lack of a policy around Israel-Palestine and a desire to really just not get involved if they can. That is something Americans have tried before. It never works, and it never works out well for anybody.
All right. The administration continuing to sit on the fence, at least when it comes to defending the rights of Palestinians. Mitchell Plitnick, thank you very much for your perspective. Good to have you on the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now, since coming to office, President Biden has kept his distance from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, calling him for the first time over 4 weeks into his administration. But the White House has repeatedly refused to condemn Israel's attacks against Palestinian civilians. The State Department issued a statement earlier this week calling on Israeli and Palestinian officials to, quote, act decisively to de-escalate tensions and bring a halt to the violence. According to a Gallup poll out this year, 53% of Democratic voters said they support increasing pressure on Israel. That's a 10-point increase from 2018. Yet a majority of Democratic lawmakers do not support conditioning aid to Israel. In a rare move last month, 18 Democratic House members co-sponsored a bill introduced by Representative Betty McCollum that would ban U.S. military aid to Israel from being used in human rights abuses against Palestinians. Following this move to condition U.S. aid to Israel, over 300 members of Congress from both parties signed a letter reiterating Congress's continued commitment to, quote, maintaining Israel's qualitative military edge to defend itself by itself against persistent threats, adding that U.S. aid to Israel is a vital and cost-effective expenditure which advances important U.S. national security interests in a highly challenging region. One of the 330 signatories, Republican Congressman August Pfluger, was due to appear on this program, but cancelled our scheduled interview shortly before we went on air. Israeli officials have committed the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution. That was the finding of a report by Human Rights Watch published at the end of April. According to the International Human Rights Organization, the aim of the report was to assess whether specific acts and policies carried out by the Israeli government constitute apartheid as defined under international law. The report pointed to Israeli restrictions on Palestinian movement and seizure of Palestinian-owned land for Jewish settlement in territory occupied in the 1967 war as examples of policies that amounted to crimes of apartheid and persecution. Just weeks before the release of the report, the International Criminal Court announced it would investigate war crimes in the Israeli-occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip. But will this lead to real accountability? And how critical is the US's continued support for Israel? Joining me now is the lead author of the report by Human Rights Watch and its Israel and Palestine director, Omar Sheikh. Omar Sheikh, Human Rights Watch says it is currently investigating the events in East Jerusalem, the efforts to forcibly evict Palestinians from their homes, and the Israeli military's use of force. Many people, though, watching the events still use terms like clashes to describe what is going on between these two very unequal sides. Words are important. How would you describe what is going on the ground?
Absolutely. Look, the situation in East Jerusalem, I think, underscores the reality of apartheid that millions of Palestinians face. The reality here is we face a situation in which Palestinians are being evicted for their homes and being replaced by Jewish Israeli settlers as part of a government plan in the municipality of Jerusalem and elsewhere for the Israeli government to maintain a sizable Jewish majority and to do so through a range of means, including evicting Palestinian residents, including boxing them into narrower and narrow enclaves. And I think the events in Jerusalem highlight this discriminatory reality.
And you've called this apartheid. Would you say that this is a clear attempt at ethnic cleansing? And if it is, what should be the legal consequences?
Look, I think this embodies the practice of apartheid. Apartheid, while coined in relation to South Africa, is a universal legal term. It's a crime against humanity set out in a range of international treaties, including the Rome Statute to the International Criminal Court. And those are the elements that we have in place in places like East Jerusalem, where you have a clear government intent or policy to maintain the domination of one group, Jewish Israelis, over another group, Palestinians, and where you have systematic oppression and inhumane acts carried out pursuant to that intent. In East Jerusalem, that includes policies like a conditional revocable residency status for hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, while Jewish Israelis living in the same territory have a secure citizenship status. It includes discriminatory allocation of resources. It includes the plundering of Palestinian land, giving it to Jewish Israeli settlements, the denial of building permits, the demolitions of Palestinian homes. These practices are really at the heart of Israel's crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution.
Does it amount to ethnic cleansing?
Ethnic cleansing, as such is not, a legal term defined under the same legal instrument. So Human Rights Watch's frame of reference is the legal terminology, and we've reached a conclusion about apartheid and persecution.
So what should then be the legal consequences to this crime, apartheid? Can there be accountability? Can there be justice for Palestinians as long as powerful countries like the US, let's face it, continue to shield Israel from any censure?
Well, let's start with the principle. There must be accountability. Crimes against humanity are identified as such because they're among the most odious crimes under international law. They're quite literally crimes against all of us. So we call, as Human Rights Watch, on the International Criminal Court to investigate and prosecute those Israeli officials implicated in the crime. We also call for national courts to do so under the principle of universal jurisdiction. The reality here is crimes of this gravity must be investigated and prosecuted, and those implicated shouldn't just be prosecuted, but they should be in the meantime subject of targeted sanctions.
But what are the chances of that happening?
In the short term, it's quite unlikely. The reality is the United States, the European Union, numerous other state actors have shielded Israel from accountability and have failed to take the steps that a situation of this gravity warrant. Step one really must be to recognize the reality for what it is. It's apartheid and its persecution for millions of Palestinians. And once you recognize that reality, it's incumbent on the international community to take the sorts of human rights and accountability measures that are required for a situation that's this serious.
And you say in your recently released report, Crossing a Threshold, that what is going on today isn't happening in a vacuum. You say it is linked to years of abuses and war crimes, an apartheid regime that Israel has run in the occupied territories for a long time. Can Palestinians count on the International Criminal Court or any other legal institution? What recourse do they really have?
Look, I mean, Palestinians have every right to be skeptical about the ability of international institutions to deal with the situation accordingly. For too long, the international community has dealt with serious crimes as symptoms of the problem, framing things around, the lack of a peace process or negotiations. And look, while all of us want there to be a political solution, that isn't around the corner. And in the meantime, a 54-year occupation is not temporary. A 30-year peace process won't dismantle systematic oppression. Millions of Palestinians deprived of their fundamental rights based on who they are isn't a temporary situation or just a matter of abusive occupation. The reality here is you can't solve a problem you misdiagnose. We must call a spade, and we must act on that basis. That won't happen overnight. It will require a paradigm shift and a shift in the way the international community engages with the reality on the ground, but it must happen today.
And for that to happen, how important is it that this paradigm shift take place in the United States? How much responsibility does the US bear for the situation? Its billions of dollars in military aid, its acquiescence to Israel's expansion of illegal settlements. How do you end this apartheid regime when the US is virtually funding Israel's occupation?
The United States absolutely has, been deeply, has green-lighted significant Israeli abuses, and I think has turned a blind eye at other times. And I think their support, including $3.8+ billion annually in military and security assistance, certainly contributes to the sort of strength that the Israeli government has. And Human Rights Watch calls on the United States and all other states to condition military and security assistance and arms sales on Israeli authorities ending apartheid and persecution. The role of the United States is quite essential. The role of the European Union and others is as well. It will take a shift among key corridors of power for there to be a future in which equality, dignity, and human rights are the baseline, not only for one group, but for all people living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea.
And you mentioned in the report that Israel is guilty of systemic oppression, trying to maintain its dominion on the Palestinian people. When you hear the US government in its statements being unwilling to condemn Israel's blatant killing of civilians, when the White House spokesperson talks about violence in, quote, Israel, when clearly she's referring to the escalating violence in occupied East Jerusalem, what implicit messages, what subliminal messages are they sending to Israel and others?
Look, I think, the credibility of international law is your ability to apply it, objectively to the same sets of facts wherever it is. And the reality is for too long, the United States, and it's not just a quirk of the Trump administration, has had a selective approach here. The reality here is East Jerusalem is occupied territory. And just as we call other occupied, territories, Crimea, for example, what they are, we should do the same thing here. And likewise, this idea that this is about, two equal, parties or sides just simply misconstrues the reality on the ground. We're talking about a context of systematic repression, a policy by one government to privilege one people at the expense of another. And you need to sort of be able to bring the terminology that's appropriate for a situation like this.
Omar Shakir, Israel and Palestine Director at the Human Rights Watch, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, if the tragic but all too familiar events unfolding in East Jerusalem and Gaza tell us anything new about the way Israel continues to enforce its military occupation in plain sight and with the ongoing tacit, if not explicit, support of the US administration, it is the willingness of a growing but still limited number of members of Congress to speak out against Israel and condemn its abuse of US military assistance, which was significantly ramped up during the Obama administration. Now some Democratic lawmakers have taken the lead in demanding that Israel be held accountable. Despite these signs of a small but growing crack in the otherwise traditionally unbreakable wall of bipartisan support for Israel, it will take more time for a real paradigm shift in the US to occur. As the US media continues to ignore the unfolding situation and Israel's threats to forcibly evict Palestinians from their homes, dozens of Democratic members of Congress still chose to side with their Republican colleagues in showing their full support for Israel and the billions of dollars it receives every year in US military aid. So, in short, while Palestinians and human rights defenders will find some solace in the slowly shifting dynamics here in Washington, they know this is still an uphill battle that won't be won easily, but one that may be slowly laying the first foundations for real change. That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry, and the team here in Washington. Send us your thoughts and comments. Till then, thanks for watching.